Alright, so we got our next video up. Failures of Reconstruction and the Rise of Jim Crow. Notice the awesome background I got going on here. Wonderful. Alright, so let's get going with the opposition to black rights here. Alright, so here's an African American in the center with all these Southern Confederate whites surrounding him. And this propensity for violence, this idea that whites are superior and that they can literally restrict whites by fear and by violent means, is going to dominate the culture of the South. And so when we talk about groups like the KKK, they come out of this, okay? They come out of this anger for having experienced Reconstruction, having to give away what they feel like is their right to own slaves, okay? So let's get going with where is the opposition the strongest. So in your notes, you should have in there this question. I hope that it's a pretty easy question, but we could say the South as an overall answer. But if you look at this map, I want you to see exactly what I'm talking about. When I say the South, okay, we're looking at Virginia and anything south of that. The Oklahoma territory that's there today, it's Oklahoma or New Mexico or even Kansas. That territory is not exactly well populated at this time. There's not a lot of people. And so what we're really talking about the South is the states that are in red at this time. Okay? So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about the South. And that is where the opposition is the strongest and where we're going to see legal systems evolve, codes of laws in each state that will keep African Americans from rising up to the equality that President Lincoln would promise going after the Civil War. So, all right. First were black codes. So these were laws, the black codes, they're laws that after the 13th Amendment is ratified were passed in the South. The 13th Amendment, again, just to refresh, that ends slavery or involuntary servitude in the United States. Okay? So the 13th Amendment's passed and black codes follow that. So for example, no Negro or freedman shall be permitted, which means to be allowed, to rent or keep a house within the limits of the town under any circumstances. So here's an example where, yes, African Americans have been freed, finally, but they can't own property. And back in the day, and really today as well, owning property is huge because then you can have a farm, you can have a plantation. This allows you to grow food. This allows you to have workers, and you can become rich. All of that starts with owning property. And so this is a way to restrict African Americans from moving up in society the way that Southern whites have been moving up in society for as long as Americans have been there. So there's a black code, and this is from Louisiana, by the way. So the black codes severely limit the freedom of newly freed African Americans. Okay, severely limit that freedom. And there's an example for you of a black code. Another practice that was used to keep African Americans in that servant-like state, that state close to slavery, which we'll get into a lot later, is sharecropping. So freedmen and poor whites worked plots of land and gave part of their crops to their owner. So if you're a sharecropper, you go onto a farmer's land, right? You're there just to work a part or a portion of their land. You do all the hard labor, you plow the fields, you sow the seeds, you wait for it to come up and you harvest that plant. You'll keep a portion of that, a portion of the corn that you harvested, the portion of the cotton that you harvested. So you could sell that or eat it to survive. But the owner, who has done nothing, allows them to just sit back, wait until their crops come in, and make a profit off of someone else's labor. And so while these people were not slaves in the sense that they weren't forced to work for labor and then relied on the master for the food, you're still relying on someone else, and you're not really moving up in society. Okay, that's really the key behind a lot of these laws, these black codes and later these Jim Crow laws, is to prevent African Americans from moving up. So sharecropping took place all over the South. Why did it take place all over the South? Because African Americans knew how to farm. They were experts at farming. But they did not have the skills and the training necessary, many illiterate, to move up through higher education or to move up to factories and manufacturing, because they just didn't have the skills or the training necessary. And so they did what they knew how to do. And while they're very good at it, they weren't able to move up within Southern society. And particularly whites, they loved this system because it was very close to the system of slavery, and it kept them in a position of power while restricting the advancement of folks of color. So sharecropping, very essential to keeping that Southern hierarchy and balance, meaning there's a group on top, the Southern whites who own plantations, and a group on the bottom, the African Americans that were recently freed. And these sharecropping numbers are huge. They're huge. So what it does is it creates a cycle of poverty. Okay? And that's your question up there. How does sharecropping lead to a cycle of poverty? And I think this particular chart really shows sharecropping. Well, it's more in depth than I think you'll ever need to know. I think it's worth going over. So a sharecropper gets that piece of land, right? He'll get some seeds, a piece of land, and then promises half the crop to the owner. That owner will sit back, hand those seeds over, and take a seat, right? The sharecropper then goes out, he buys the food and clothing on credit from that landowner's store, or goes to the market, buys on credit, meaning that you don't have the money up front, so now you buy what you don't have with someone else's money. This allows you to go out, spread the seed, collect all the produce that you get, and sell it. And once you're done selling it, now you not only are you having to buy your food on credit, now you're having to essentially give away half your crop and also pay back people that you owed money for. So that's how that double-edged sword comes down. So to pay that debt, a sharecropper must promise a landowner a greater share of next year's crop. Often, they just don't have enough money to cover the money that they borrowed, because landowners are very cheap. They want to hold off their money. So it says, by the time sharecroppers had shared their crops and paid their debts, they rarely had any money left. And that's really the key, that cycle of poverty. They aren't educated, and they're not able to argue with landowners, because landowners are rich white men who essentially cheat them out of money because they can. Those black codes give power to the whites, and African Americans have little or no recourse. And so you get caught in this cycle of debt over and over and over again, and African Americans are not able to move up in society. And I think that's been a theme so far throughout this video. So African Americans not being able to move up in society because they have to pay back debts and give away a portion of the profits from their crop. Now, black codes and later Jim Crow laws, well, I'll get to that. I know I keep throwing that out there. I will get to it. Create a system called segregation. This is a key vocabulary term for you to know, not even in this class, but as a citizen, as a functional citizen in America. Okay? Segregation is the separation of races in all public places, including restaurants, housing, and education. That is, the colored side is in the back. Anyone who is African American, Latino, have any skin color at all, you go to the rear. The whites are served up front. That's how it is. Okay? It's almost difficult to imagine that nowadays, But back then, there was a clear line between whites and blacks in all public places. Okay? White schools versus colored schools. And so you get scenes like this. Okay? We won't go to school with Negroes. That kid in the middle there. This type of scene, this clear cut between African Americans and whites, is so prevalent throughout the South. Here we have, even on your left side of your screen, the water fountains, the typical colored versus white water fountains. And what I want you to notice about this picture, okay, the white water fountain is in top shape. Looks nice and new and well kept. Where you look at the colored water fountain and it looks old and looks like it might be leaking. And that, not just about water fountains, but apply that to schools, where schools feature roofs that are caving in and leaking water for a colored school, while whites have access to pristine buildings newly built. Okay, that's the scene that segregation sets up, where African Americans are forced to go to places that are not in good kept conditions, terrible conditions, honestly, while whites receive all the public funding so that they can have nice schools and nice water fountains, nice bathrooms, well kept. That's a scene that's set up. So now the rise of Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws are laws that follow black codes. Black codes are outlawed, right? And so Jim Crow laws take their place, right? So laws that create segregation and limit African American freedoms are Jim Crow laws. And specifically, Jim Crow restricts voting. That is one of the key elements of Jim Crow. Segregation plus voting. They do not want African Americans voting. Why? If you vote, you can vote for people that will repeal the Jim Crow laws. So in order to keep established powers, established white people in office that support Jim Crow, you have to prevent African Americans from going to the ballot box, from casting votes. I know it's one of the things that we take for granted in our society right now, but this voting system was a way of moving up, because people like the sharecroppers couldn't move up unless they had people in the voting, in the established political system, that they could vote into power, that could help swipe away some of the bad things that were happening to sharecroppers or to African Americans in spite of segregation. So here's a couple Jim Crow laws here. There's a bunch of them. Some of them are most of them are out of left field. Like, you wouldn't think of this being a law, but they are. They are. So the city of Baltimore establishes separate living districts for blacks, meaning that African Americans can only settle in a particular part of the city, and that creates areas of segregation. Mississippi enacts separate public transportation legislation. That's 1922 you're looking at down there. So there are a bunch of laws here, and I picked a couple 1900 laws because I wanted you to see how current it is, how it wasn't that long ago that Jim Crow was dominating the legal field. So that was over on the right. Over on the left, it shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers. Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama. I looked at that law and I said, oh my gosh, you can't play cards with one another. But that's the level of segregation here. That is the mindset that Southerners are operating against. There's a hate there for African Americans, and they don't want other whites to even be near African Americans, let alone play games with them. Okay, and the last one on the bottom there, no colored barber, meaning a haircutter or salonist, shall serve as a barber to white women or girls. There was a big issue amongst white males of keeping their white women away from African Americans. There are case after case of violence because African American males wouldn't move over to the other side of the sidewalk while a white female would be walking down, and he may receive violence for that. The KKK could come, which we'll talk about later. So I gave you a bunch of laws you could even look up, and a law that you think is pretty left field and bring it in. I'd really appreciate that. But give me an example of a Jim Crow law. Okay, give me an example of a Jim Crow law. Anyone on here or one that you find. Now on to voting restrictions. So if I were to ask you to give me an example of a Jim Crow law, you could do one of the ones that were on the other side. These are like the big three, if you will. If you watch NBA basketball, you know that they're the big three model. Well, I'm giving you the big three model, not for winning an NBA championship, but for understanding Jim Crow laws. Here's the big three model. Poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests. A poll tax is where voters have to actually pay to vote. Now think about this. If you're African American, recently freed, you're probably a sharecropper, you didn't even have enough money to buy your clothes, your food to last you to start the harvest. So you had to borrow that money. Where are you going to come up with more money to borrow to pay to vote? So that is a huge issue there. Poll taxes restrict people who really don't have any money to vote. And so rich people dominate the voting, particularly in the South. The next one is a grandfather clause. And while this eventually gets repealed, all of them get repealed eventually. If your father or grandfather was a slave, you were ineligible to vote in the South. This is particularly important because slaves, as we know, have just been emancipated. A grandfather clause will prevent these people from being able to vote. Lastly, a literacy test will be enacted. Literacy meaning the ability to read a certain text or document. So you actually have to go out there and pass a test and be able to show that you can write in order to vote. All right, so these big three here, we need to know these. The poll taxes, the grandfather clause, and the literacy test all work together to keep African Americans away from the polls. And why are these things so effective? I've talked about it previously, but one more time. African Americans have been uneducated slaves. Put that in reference for yourself. Think about that. You've been an uneducated slave. You haven't been allowed to go to school. That has no money, really, just the clothes on your back. Hopefully you've gotten to the Freedmen's Bureau. But if you didn't, you have nothing. And you don't have any knowledge to get past all these restrictions. You don't have the initial capital, meaning the initial money, and you don't have the knowledge to beat some of these tests. So the big three of Jim Crow comes down hard on African Americans and keeps them locked in the social position that they were prior to being emancipated. It doesn't stop there, though. So I'm going to take you to the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson. There are not a ton of Supreme Court cases that I'm going to make you know. But this one in particular, you gotta know. Again, it's one of those things that comes down to, as an American citizen, you should have some idea of what Plessy versus Ferguson is. Okay? Plessy versus Ferguson says that segregation was legal so long as separate facilities were equal. So what that means is that if African Americans are going to separate bathrooms, right? Those bathrooms can be separated as long as the upkeep is the same. So as long as the toilets are kept in good condition on either side. While that may sound, I guess, fair in some capacity, rarely are these ever equal. White bathrooms and fountains, as you saw from the picture earlier, are in way better condition than the American bathrooms and fountains. So while they say separate is equal, separate is rarely ever equal. Okay, that is the big thing that you need to understand about Plessy versus Ferguson. So here we got on the left side whites, a water fountain, get your angels pouring the water in, and then African American water fountain, they've got to go out there and pump out their own water. This political cartoon addresses what Plessy versus Ferguson really is. That separate is far from equal. Far from it. Okay? Far from it. So, I love that political cartoon. Pretty awesome. Next, the KKK. You might know of it. We'll cover it a little bit. So, white supremacist group. Okay, what is white supremacy? It's the belief that whites are superior to blacks. This is a real thing. They really believe this, that at the core, whites were actually a better human being race than African Americans. To that end, they would use terror and violence to keep African Americans who chose to resist Jim Crow laws. I know that sounds a little abstract. I'm saying terror and violence. What do I mean? I'll show some examples. But here's that corrupt bargain here going on. The KKK and whites, the White League as they call themselves, whites on the left and the KKK on the right, work together to keep African Americans afraid and keep African Americans in a position where they can no longer rise up. And even in the back, if you notice, they've got some lynching going on, which I'll get to. Schoolhouses burning to the right. This is a violent, violent place to be for African Americans if you're living in the South. So here are the tactics. Like I said, I could say them to you all day, but you gotta see them. You gotta see them to understand. So here's the cross burning that's used to terrorize families, and then the lynching. African Americans literally hanged off of trees. I didn't want to show that. It's really graphic and a little just really disturbing, honestly. But the cross burning, no less disturbing, really, and all these white people dressed with the sheets over their heads. That is a typical uniform worn by KKK members. All right, and results of Jim Crow. So, freedom for African Americans, not that perfect picture that Lincoln and some of the other Republicans drew up. African Americans are going to be excluded from voting. We talked about the big three that operate together to keep African Americans from the polls. African Americans will receive the poorest of housing, the worst jobs, and really are restricted from a lot of the education. And it takes a long time for African Americans to kind of get going and get out of the cycle of poverty that whites try to keep them in. And real change would not take place until a man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. led the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Reconstruction, again, I said starts in 1866, so please do the math there. It's rough. And that'll be our next video. Thanks for watching. See you guys.